Hi,
Hi.
Chang from UK. Thanks for making your time to raise that, talking about this very important and sensitive issue, especially for Chinese community. I don't see a lot of Asia face here, but thank you. I have two questions for you.
There's a guy over here.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So 1, 2, 3, 4. 4. There she is.
Thank you for coming.
5. Sorry, forgot you, Norman. Sorry.
So I basically have two questions for you. Number one, we can see the war is here, if not really, but in certain format, no matter Cold War or real military conflict, whatever. So if something happens, what's your message to our Chinese community? I'm talking about average individual here, all right? Nothing to do with the government, nothing to do with the CPP. CCP, Chinese Communist Party. Okay. Question number two. I mean, how do we help people, average American people? When I say average, I guarantee everyone in this room is not average, okay? You are definitely beyond average. I'm talking about average American people. How do we let them know the potential damage or, the dangers of the CCP and its central government? It's been there forever. It's not like every 4 years come up to, as the topic, unite both parties in Washington. It's been there. It just, people maybe not aware of that. Also, I think more important is the form, the concept behind the country. I mean, the CCP party. You can see all those the movement, all those are cancel culture. It's the American version of Cultural Revolution. People have to aware of that. We've been there, saw that. But I mean, for the generation here, they think, oh, I have a big heart, I have a lot of love, I want to solve everything. Come on, rescue yourself first.
Yeah.
The second part, I'm sorry, real quick. So not only aware of that, but also help average American people to differentiate individual like me here from the government over there. Okay. So if something happens, the central camp is coming up. What are we gonna do? What you guys gonna do?
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. You mentioned Cultural Revolution, and that's important because there's a woman in Northern Virginia, I think Loudoun County, C. Van Fleet, and she went to her school board and told the school board that what they were trying to do was like the Cultural Revolution, and the media picked it up. And so people are now starting to talk about that. So that's one thing that we can do, is just go talk to your school board or go talk to your neighbors or whatever. It's just, so many people. It's just geometric progression of one person talking to the next, And that really answers, I think, your first question. Beijing propagates, one of the narratives is that, well, you can't criticize the Chinese Communist Party because that would put Chinese Americans at risk. I actually have a different take on that, and that is many Chinese Americans openly support a regime which is our enemy. And you see this, I was in San Francisco about a couple of weeks ago, and you look down in Chinatown and you see all these PRC flags that are floating over Chinatown. And other Americans, I think, legitimately have the right to ask, who are these people? Why are they in our country? So the answer to your question about what you can do to protect yourself as a Chinese American is the answer to your second question, which is to talk about these things, to make it clear that you are an American, that your loyalty is to America, and that you oppose Chinese Americans who support Chinese communism. It's as simple as that. It's a very controversial thing, but the point is, I think Chinese Americans, no American has an obligation to speak up. I mean, one of the First Amendment rights is to be silent, actually. But I do think that for Chinese Americans, as a practical matter, they do have an obligation to speak up because so many Chinese Americans appear to everybody else to be disloyal. And so I do think that Norman and you and Lydia and me and you have an obligation to show that we do not support Chinese communism.
Murilla from Southington. My question is, next year, not only do we have a presidential election in the United States, but in Paris, there's the Summer Olympics. Last year in the Winter Olympics, there was an American of Chinese ancestry who represented China. And I just, we're American, doesn't matter where our ancestors came from. I just wanted your view on this because I also heard talk about boycotting the Olympics next year because of the invasion of Russia into Ukraine.
Okay, you're referring to Eileen Gu, who won some gold medals. She was an American citizen. I don't know how China has a rule that you can't have dual nationality. So I don't know how she was able to compete for China. In other words, she has to be a Chinese national. So the logical thing is she had to give up her American nationality to do that. Now, if we had a president of the United States who had an imagination, he would say, and by the way, Eileen Gu has now come back and she's at Stanford and happily taking advantage of her American citizenship. I would say, look, I don't know how you did it, Eileen, but obviously you gave up your American nationality and you're just not welcome in this country anymore.
Hi, I'm Leora Levy, former
Yay!
Thank you. Thank you so much. I also was nominated to be ambassador to Chile, and in my time working at the State Department under Secretary Pompeo, that State Department was very aware of China's malign economic influence throughout the Western Hemisphere and Africa, their hegemonic economic predatory practices, and the risks that those pose for us. We have an administration now that is completely ignoring that. Could you talk about that, about their Belt and Road and what they're doing? And then, you are more charitable than I toward this administration. Could you talk about the possible motives or reasons beyond being ignorant?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, there is a guy called Hunter Biden, after all. And there's a lot that can be said. Let me just say that his financial relationships with China don't happen in the absence of corruption or influence peddling. The Chinese themselves talk about Hunter Biden in this context, and that is, they say, and there was a famous academic named Di Dongsheng who gave a live stream presentation on November 28th, 2020, right after the election, who said that the regime was looking forward to Biden coming back into the White House because they could then again exercise control over decisions. And Dee actually mentioned that during the 4 years of the Trump administration, China no longer had its traditional lines of influence, which he mentioned were two, Wall Street and Henry Kissinger. But we won't dwell on Henry Kissinger because my wife's here and she'll get angry at me if I rant. See, I have this, it says no. See, I have this thing here which says no rant, which is because it's a long ride home to New Jersey. But anyway, that's what the Chinese themselves say about Hunter Biden. And there's also something, it's more than just money. It's also, Hunter Biden, by his own admission, is a troubled individual. He was on Chinese soil when he went with his dad on Air Force 2 to China. If he did anything compromising there, which is high probability, then the Ministry of State Security will have evidence of that. And probably the dad knows about that and so therefore is intimidated. But I will say one other thing about Biden, and that is, even if there were no blackmail, even if there was no influence peddling, Biden's views about the world are stuck in like a world of 40 years ago. And so he doesn't need to be bought. He's just plain misguided when it comes to this whole notion of where the world is today. The world is dividing into two. You got China and Russia forming the core of a new axis. Along there are Pakistan, Iran, North Korea, perhaps Algeria, their proxies. Biden doesn't talk about this. He refuses to acknowledge that the world has indeed broken into two. And if you can't acknowledge what everybody else can see, then you can't deal with it. So whether Biden is bought or whether he's just plain stupid, it doesn't matter. He is not protecting our country. On your first question, Latin America is a bipartisan American failure. In the countries that are closest to us, we haven't had any president for as long as I can remember who has spent any time thinking about our activities in the region. So we've opened the door to China actually coming in and exercising influence. Also, you got to remember that this happens at a particularly bad time for us. So for instance, since 2018, the election of Obrador in Mexico as president, AMLO, that started a pink wave. And since that, we've seen election of progressives in Brazil as of the end of last year. But between Mexico and Brazil, 7 conservative governments turned leftist. This is serious because this year and next, 11 more presidential elections in the region. So this is occurring at a time where China is taking advantage of that. But these are our underlying trends because China's put a lot of money in. Now, China's put a lot of money into the region, but their projects are being actually counterproductive because they don't make economic sense. That's a long-term, big discussion. But the point is, China can take over some of these projects and exercise military control over some of these countries. Just to give you an example, in Freeport in the Bahamas, China has built a container port, put about $3.4 billion into it. That container port's having problems. China could very well repossess it, like they repossessed a port in Sri Lanka in 2017, and that could end up in Freeport being a Chinese military base, which, by the way, is 87 miles east of Palm Beach. We do not want the Chinese having a military base 87 miles east of Palm Beach. This is a really important question. I don't want to bore everybody here about this, but we Americans need to start paying attention to Latin America and the Caribbean, because if we don't, we're going to have the Chinese snug up against our border. And remember, they're already controlling, in a sense, that border with Mexico because of their relations with the 2 fentanyl cartels.
Who would have thought we would be talking about Kimoy and Matsu again in our lifetime, right?
Right.
I'm really dating myself there. I think another point I'd like to hear you talk about, and I can just give you just a quick personal issue, is the incredible influx of Chinese students in our secondary and our colleges. And they're not here to learn about democracy and go back and spread the word back in the mainland. In my prep school, the Gunnery, I noticed a huge influx of Chinese students, and in my day we had a handful of foreign exchange students. There are at least 30 or 40 students at Gunnery that are all from the mainland, and I guarantee you they're not from middle-class families. They all pay cash, tuition up front, they contribute to the annual fund, and they don't show up on Alumni Day, trust me. And I know it sounds a little callous, but I'm a pretty regular person at these events, and I've watched this over time. They do not assimilate with other kids in the school. They speak Cantonese among themselves. They leave, they go on to other colleges, and then they, I guess, stay here and then work their way into our economy, and then we have the whole issue of espionage. And I know a lot of people, it's not politically correct, but a lot of these schools are taking the money from the tuition, they're taking the money for the annual fund and the foundation of the headmaster, whatever, and they are not assimilating, you would think, according to what you would hope for. But I think it's another part of this issue that a lot of people don't want to say in polite company, but it's there. I can at least say, from my personal perspective, it's there.
Yeah, this is really important because, as you say, colleges and universities can't move too much.
You're on camera.
No ranting.
Yeah, no ranting.
No moving, no ranting. That's China.
Yeah, I was going to move around, but I guess I'm not going to. Before COVID, there was something like 390,000 Chinese students in the United States. and the estimate was about 13% of them were committing acts of espionage. This is a really difficult problem. There's two aspects to it, and let me talk about one of them that doesn't really get discussed very often, and that is that you mentioned that the Chinese students don't mix with others, and that's generally true throughout colleges and universities and prep schools. And the reason for that, and it's not just cultural, it's because we have allowed Republicans, Democrats, liberals, and conservatives have allowed Chinese consular officials and Ministry of State security agents to surveil Chinese students on campuses. There's something called the Chinese Students and Scholars Association, known as CSIT, which is essentially run by the Communist Party. And they've got various cells wherever there are Chinese students on campuses. Those are meant to make sure that Chinese students remain loyal to China and will commit acts of espionage or whatever the Chinese government wants them to. And indeed, Beijing organizes them to engage in political protests in our country, which is a violation of our sovereignty. So we shouldn't be allowing that. Now, first of all, I think the answer to the question would be, let's make sure that the Chinese government, there are no more CISA chapters, no more diplomats, no more Ministry of State security agents, get them out. And then let's see what happens with Chinese students. I think that they would start to integrate because many of them do want to stay here. And many of them are just motivated and coerced by fear. We do that, then we can see how much of a problem we still have. And then we can, at that point, deal with it. But in the first instance, this is our fault for allowing China to coerce students.
Yeah. Thank you.
Pam, by the way, Katie has a question.
Hi, Gordon Kendra from Madison. I have a question. I understand how somebody like Hunter Biden can be so compromised, so flawed, but how does it explain, I don't quite understand how China compromises so many of our military officials or other government officials to do things that seem so much against our country's interest.
Yeah. China works very hard at it, and they do it through a number of different ways. One of them is, they promote this idea that it's in our interest to support the Communist Party, and that's been very effective because we've had presidents, both Republicans and Democrats, who have in fact rescued the Communist Party at times of its peril. Just to give you an example, Richard Nixon did it in 1972. George H.W. Bush did that in 1989, and Bill Clinton did it in 1999. And God knows what Biden's got up his sleeve right now. So that's part of it. But the other part of it is just money. It's sort of like, for instance, Huawei, the Chinese national champion telecom equipment provider. I mean, they just bought. They bought Vitter, the Republican senator from Louisiana who is now retired. They just do that. They just throw tons of cash at them, and so there's a question of money, but it's also, I'm sure, blackmail. China's very good at knowing the weakness of a person. When I was practicing law in Hong Kong, one of my clients was a multinational U.S. bank. Its regional head actually went to China, slept with a prostitute, and basically they bought that guy. And in this particular case, they wanted him out of the way because they had their own person to take his place who was actually a secret member of the Communist Party. But it happens that there's just a number of different ways they do it. And they are, they're utterly malicious at it. So they're better at it than any other state in terms of compromising people. And we've just got, the one good thing though is that the Chinese economy, as I mentioned, is in trouble. They're not going to have money for all of this to the extent that they've been able to do it. So at least that eliminates one of the things. But we have a long way to go to make sure, because we have a national security establishment that is some days more loyal to the Communist Party than it is to us.
Katie, have a question?
Yeah,
Katie's
sure.
been heckled, but let her.
Thank you, Katie Russell from Deep River, Connecticut. Following up on Leora's earlier question, what do you advise, if anything, that we do on a grassroots level to help expose and ensure accountability for Joe Biden's corruption with China?
That's a toughie. That is a toughie. It's going to be, taking for instance the New York Post stories. Miranda Devine, who broke the story about Hunter's life, she's a real hero. So what we can do is take Miranda's stories and just send them to our friends. Now, of course, as we know, during the 2020 election, the New York Post was deplatformed by big social media sites. But now, this time, we know that that can't be done for various reasons. But let's take her stories and circulate them around. Because she's a real hero, and she writes about Hunter Biden all the time. She writes about Chinese corruption, going back to your point over here. So that's the one thing that we can do. And of course, next year is the presidential election year. We've just got to fight hard. But this, again, is grassroots organizing. And this is one of those things that is difficult to do. You only win a person at a time, but you win enough people. This is important. Now, you guys are from Connecticut, and you might say, well, what's the point?
We do.
Okay, but I'm from New Jersey. And a year ago, if the Republican National Committee had put, as they say, $5 million more into the campaign, we would have a Republican governor in New Jersey. But they decided not to because they felt they couldn't win New Jersey. But let's make the Democrats, let's make all those forces fight for Connecticut. Because if they have to put money in Connecticut because of you guys, that means they're not putting money into North Carolina or some other purple state. So make these guys fight. And as we say in New Jersey, maybe we'll do it next time.
Irene Newquist from Glastonbury. I'm a pharmacist, and for the past several years, we have experienced tremendous shortages in medications, very common medications, and it's not getting any better. And my fear has always been what you described eloquently, how individuals can be bought and blackmailed. But I feel as a country, we're going to be held hostage because most of our medications come from China.
Yeah, and this is not a theoretical concern because in March of 2020, which was coronavirus time, China actually threatened to throw us into what they called, quote, a mighty sea of coronavirus. They actually turned around some ships on the high seas that had personal protective equipment that was coming to New York, but which they wanted themselves, so they did that. They actually nationalized a factory making N95 masks, an American factory making N95 masks. And this doesn't even go to the whole issue of penicillin and all sorts of things that we rely on. This one, you need actually the President of the United States to use his authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977 just to force pharmaceutical companies out of China. And Biden won't do it. Trump started along this line. One of the last things he did was he authorized a $750 million loan for Eastman Kodak to make active pharmaceutical ingredients, but the plan was misconceived, so it never went anywhere. But the point is, we need to start thinking of this as industrial policy, which means that we need the federal government to put money behind it. And I know that that's controversial, but the point is, this is not it'll be terribly inefficient, but the point is, this is a matter of national security. We need pharmaceuticals manufactured in the US. Same thing with the semiconductor issue. The Wall Street Journal did the editorial saying that the CHIPS Act, which was big subsidies for Intel and other companies, was going to be grossly inefficient. And yeah, that's absolutely right. But the journal was missing the point. This is not a question of economic efficiency. This is a question that we need to make these vital components for everything that we use on our own soil. We cannot rely on China to do it. And the same thing with pharmaceuticals. So I absolutely agree with you. One other point, though, that people don't talk about. China has threatened and sometimes imposed boycotts on countries it doesn't like because of geopolitical reasons. But those boycotts have generally failed. They, for instance, imposed a boycott on rare earth exports to Japan in 2010 over an East China Sea claim. It failed because the Japanese ended up buying rare earths from Chinese enterprises anyway, under the table. Because remember, not only do we need to buy, the Chinese need to sell. And so the Japanese were very clever at the way they did this, and we need to be able to do the same thing. And by the way, even if we could never buy anything from a Chinese company, those Chinese companies have got to sell to somebody in Europe or Latin America or wherever, and we can buy from them. So there are ways around this, but I would prefer not to have to go through that and to have this stuff manufactured on our soil, because this is a national security issue.
My name is Nancy. I'm from Glastonbury. I'm so grateful that you're here today and to hear all of your remarks. I wonder if it's possible to have a copy of your first remarks distributed to all of us.
I'll take out the no rant.
So,
yeah, I will do it. I will do it. I got to clean it up a little bit because there are stuff.
I'll say, Gordon, if it's too much to do, we're videotaping, and if it comes out okay, we're happy to just. Okay, Lydia's gonna do it.
So, yeah, we will do that. And by the way, we're so pleased and honored to be here. So it's mutual.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Helen. I'm from Madison. My question involves the real estate that China owns in our country. Is it a forever fact, or is there a way to take our land back?
Yeah, it's not a forever fact because it's our land. It just takes political will. Now, I believe, first of all, that no, and this gets a little complicated, but I believe that no Chinese national or entity should own farm or ranch land in the U.S. As I said, and my proposal would be, we just expropriate it. Now, we have to pay compensation. That's part of the Constitution. I have no problem with that. But for Chinese parties that are using farm or ranch land for criminal activities, the federal government can apply forfeiture statutes, because under our Constitution, if someone uses land for a criminal purpose, that can be seized, confiscated by the federal government without compensation. And we know the Chinese are doing some pretty dastardly things on our property. So my favorite state on this is Oklahoma. In Oklahoma, Chinese parties, people will tell you who come from there, the Chinese parties are building fences. No big deal. Everybody in Oklahoma builds a fence. But people in Oklahoma build fences to keep people out. The Chinese are building fences in Oklahoma to keep people in. And that should be a hint that this is really dangerous. Now, in November of last year, 4 Chinese nationals were killed in a gangland slaying on Chinese-owned property, probably killed by another Chinese party, which means that the triads are coming over here, which means we don't want them in Oklahoma. You know, we got enough crime of our own. We don't need more Chinese coming here committing crime. So I think that what we should do is either the governor of Oklahoma or the president of the United States should just expropriate that property. Not expropriate, but confiscate that property without compensation. Let's get these guys off of our land. Got to remember that under the Communist Party's top-down system, every Chinese national, every Chinese entity can never refuse a demand of the Communist Party, which means that these guys are under a compulsion to commit acts which are illegal and destructive to the United States. There's also something called the 2017 Chinese National Intelligence Law, which, going back to your point, Chris, every Chinese national under Article 7 and 14 of that law are under a compulsion to commit espionage if they receive a demand from the Communist Party or from the Chinese central government. So Chinese parties here are under a compulsion to commit crimes, legal compulsion to commit crimes. That sets them apart. This is not racial, by the way. This is their system requires them to take acts to destroy our country. I just don't want any more of this. I want them out of our country.
Gordon, would you mind talking about Taiwan and its importance to us as Americans?
Yeah, I briefly went through that. I mean, the three things I mentioned were there: our Western defense perimeter, democracy, and now it's a test of American credibility. And of course, there's something else, and that is Taiwan makes. There's one Taiwan company, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC. You might see it on CNBC. Makes 92% of the world's made-to-order chips. Made-to-order chips are the most sophisticated semiconductors. These are semiconductors that Americans design, but we don't make any of them. But TSMC does. And you can imagine if that company falls into the hands of mainland China. So, I mean, that would be lights out for the United States. So this is another reason why we don't want Taiwan falling into the hands of China. So there's so many different reasons. And you know, people might say, well, it's on the other side of the world, what does it matter? And the point here now is that almost everything matters, because we now got a war on the the western end of the Eurasian landmass. We don't need a war on the other end of that landmass, because that's World War III when you start thinking about it. And obviously Taiwan would be one of the primary targets for Xi Jinping. So if we're going to prevent the world from falling into chaos and destruction, then we need to reestablish deterrence. And that's the reason why. We just do not want, we got this period of general peace since the end of the Second World War. If China invades Taiwan or Japan or the Philippines or whatever, that period is over. And we go to a period of constant turbulence, which is a very different world than the one that we've been living in for 7 decades. So those are 2 additional reasons why Taiwan's important. Which, by the way, I've just learned where Essex is. So.
Next
You
to the
have?
river.
Yeah.
Why? It's pretty small. Okay, my question is, I believe it's the 10,000 talents that China has a program to, yeah, I'm sure you know.
Yeah, 1,000 Talents program.
1,000 talents program. And that was, there was an FBI arrest of people just before COVID, and part of that, they were part of that 1,000 talent. Could you explain?
Yeah. China has a number of different programs to obtain information from and learning from American universities and colleges, and that's one of them. And you were talking about an arrest. You probably were referring to Charles Lieber, who was the chairman of the chemistry department at Harvard, who was actually recruited in the 1,000 Talents program, and who's now he was convicted for failing to disclose his ties to Communist China, though not for espionage, because that's a harder claim to prove. But the point is that we have a number of those throughout the universities, because he's only one of them. Now, the Trump administration started what's called the China Initiative in the Justice Department to root out this, and Biden has ended that. That's a long story. But the point is that we need the FBI to have a focus on this, because China's made a very concerted effort over the course of decades to take our technology, whether we give it to them or steal it if we don't give it to them. Obviously, we shouldn't be giving it to them, but the point is that they have really made it a point to strengthen their country by taking our technology. And the reason why this is important is because John Ratcliffe, in the last month or so that he was Director of National Intelligence, estimated, this was December, I think, November 2020, he estimated that the amount of intellectual property that the Chinese steal each year was in the neighborhood of $500 billion. So, $500 billion each and every year. Obviously the biggest theft in history, and it's continuing. So we have to end that.